we find that a village which is practically the same as at the time of Jesus. Beside the houses as they stood.
You can still see the frescoes inside of this burial chamber. Now, just on the other side of this wall, archaeologists long suspected there was another burial chamber.
Beneath the mud of the Sea of Galilee lies a secret buried for over 1,000 years. Archaeologists have uncovered a lost village, Bethsaida, hometown of Peter, and a mysterious inscription that hints he was guarding something far older, far stranger, and far more powerful than anyone imagined. But what exactly was he protecting, and why has history hidden it from us for so long? Today we peel back centuries of earth, history, and legend to reveal what the world almost forgot, and what could change everything we thought we knew about the dawn of Christianity. Secrets of Bethsaida. For nearly a century, biblical archaeologists have been locked in a heated debate that sounds almost absurd on the surface. Where exactly was Bethsaida? The name itself means House of the Fishermen, a village so important that 3 of Jesus' apostles called it home: Peter, Andrew, and Philip.
It also revealed new evidence about the birthplace of 3 of Jesus' disciples, Peter, Andrew, and Philip.
All grew up here, walking its dusty streets before they ever set foot in a boat with a carpenter from Nazareth. Yet despite its significance, the actual location of this fishing village had become one of archaeology's most frustrating mysteries. The problem began in the 1980s when excavators started digging at a site called Et Tel, perched on a hillside northeast of the Sea of Galilee. What they found was spectacular: Iron Age fortifications, Hellenistic pottery, evidence of a thriving ancient settlement. Excitement rippled through the archaeological community. Finally, Bethsaida had been found. But then someone asked an uncomfortable question. Why would a fishing village be built 2.5 kilometers from the water? The ancient Jewish historian Josephus had been clear in his writings. Bethsaida sat on the shore of the lake. The Gospels describe Jesus walking from the village to the water's edge. The entire economy of the place revolved around fishing. A hilltop location made no sense whatsoever. It was like discovering Manhattan in Kansas. Technically possible, but fundamentally wrong. Enter El Araj, a waterlogged, mosquito-infested patch of land directly on the lakeshore, buried beneath the crumbling ruins of a 19th-century Ottoman mansion called Beit Habeck. Back in 1930, a German priest named Rudolf de Haas had noticed fragments of an ancient mosaic roughly 2 meters below the Ottoman structure, and he assumed it was Roman and moved on. He was wrong. It was Byzantine. And it would take 86 years before anyone bothered to find out why a Byzantine church had been built in such a miserable location. In 2016, Professor Mordecai Aviam and Dr. Stephen Notley began systematic excavations at El Araj, and what they encountered was archaeological chaos. The site flooded regularly. Petrol pumps ran continuously just to keep the trenches from turning into swimming pools. Summer temperatures soared past 40 degrees Celsius. Equipment corroded within weeks. One volunteer later described it as digging through porridge in a sauna while being eaten alive by swarms of mosquitoes from the nearby nature reserve.
Desert bloom is unsustainable, and the demise of the Sea of Galilee must send that message to Israeli politicians.
But they kept digging, and season by season, layer by layer, a stratigraphic miracle emerged. At the top, Ottoman and medieval remains. Below that, Crusader artifacts. Deeper still, a substantial Byzantine basilica with elaborate mosaics and marble fixtures. And then, sealed beneath 40 centimeters of lake silt, exactly what you'd expect if the Sea of Galilee had risen and drowned a settlement, they found it. First-century Jewish pottery, coins minted by Herod Philip, the ruler who had transformed the fishing village of Bethsaida into the Greco-Roman city of Julias. Limestone vessels, the hallmark of observant Jewish households in ancient Galilee. They had found Bethsaida, the real one. The fishing village directly on the water, exactly where Josephus said it would be, exactly where the Gospels placed it. Not on a distant hilltop, but right here. Drowned by the lake's rising waters in the 3rd century and preserved beneath the mud like a photograph in a developer's tray. The significance was staggering. This wasn't just another archaeological site. This was the childhood home of Peter, the man who would become the foundation of the Christian church. The place where fishermen became fishers of men. And buried beneath 15 centuries of silt, something extraordinary was waiting. An inscription that would change everything. Peter's hidden home. The excavation conditions at El Araj were brutal. The site sits barely above the current waterline, and during winter rains, the Sea of Galilee regularly floods the trenches. Petrol-powered pumps ran almost continuously, pushing water out of the excavation squares while the team worked knee-deep in gray silt. And the heat in summer regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Equipment corroded, recording sheets soaked through, trowels clogged with clay every few minutes and had to be cleaned with lake water that was itself silty. Wheelbarrows loaded with spoil sank axle-deep into the access paths, and the mosquitoes breeding in the standing water of the adjacent Bethsaida Nature Reserve were so persistent that the team took to wearing head nets during the afternoon shifts. One volunteer from the 2019 season later described the experience as digging through porridge in a sauna while being eaten alive. But the church emerged. Season by season, between 2016 and 2022, the team uncovered the footprint of a substantial Byzantine basilica, oriented roughly east to west, with an apse, a nave, and ancillary rooms including a diaconicon, the sacristy where vestments and liturgical objects were stored. The floors were paved with mosaics, not simple geometric patterns but elaborate compositions, floral motifs in the Byzantine style.
A large church from the Byzantine period that has been unearthed at Beth Habek near the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee.
Medallions framed by concentric lines of black tesserae, figural elements that spoke of wealth and institutional backing. Fragments of a marble chancel screen were recovered, the carved barrier that separated the sacred altar area from the congregation. This was not a modest rural chapel. This was a church built to impress, a church built to commemorate. The question was, commemorate what? The Byzantine Christians did not build major basilicas on a whim. Each church marked a site of profound spiritual significance, a place where the faithful believed heaven and earth had touched. The last Christian voice of the late Roman period, Eusebius of Caesarea, wrote his onomasticon in 304 CE, and when he mentioned Bethsaida, he cited it for one thing above all, being the home of the apostles. Not for the healing of the blind man from Mark's Gospel, not for the feeding of the multitudes which Luke's Gospel places on the outskirts of the village, but for the apostles themselves, Peter, Andrew, Philip, the men who had walked with Jesus along this very shore. The answer came from a Bavarian bishop named Willibald, who made a pilgrimage to the holy sites of the Sea of Galilee in the year 724 CE, 25 years before a catastrophic earthquake would destroy much of the region. His travel account, known as the Hodoeporikon, records his journey along the northern shore. And then they went to Bethsaida, the residence of Peter and Andrew, where there is now a church on the site of their house. A church built over the house of Peter and Andrew, the church of the apostles, and here it was, exactly where Willibald said it would be, beneath the mosaics. But the excavators were not content with the church. They wanted what was underneath it, because the Byzantines did not build their basilicas at random. As Professor Aviam has explained, Byzantine churches were always constructed with the apse positioned directly over a sacred relic or a venerated site. If this was the Church of the Apostles, then beneath its apse should lie whatever the Byzantine builders believed was the house of Peter and Andrew. In the 2023 season, conservator Yehoshua Dre carefully removed sections of the mosaic floor in the apse to excavate what lay below. What they found was a wall. A substantial stone wall, predating the church, ran beneath the apse on an alignment that did not match the basilica's orientation. The church's builders had deliberately adjusted the alignment of their late 5th century reconstruction to follow this older wall, even though it meant the basilica was no longer precisely oriented east-west. They had chosen an older structure over liturgical convention. They had built their church around a memory. The wall dated to the 2nd or 3rd century, meaning it could not have been Peter's own house, which would date to the 1st century.
Israeli archaeologists have discovered writing on a charred 1,500-year-old piece of parchment using advanced digital imaging technology.
But beside it, in the surrounding excavation area, the team uncovered domestic structures from the Roman period, with 1st century pottery, fishing weights carved from local limestone, bronze hooks corroded to a pale green patina, clay oil lamps blackened by soot, and coins so worn by handling that their inscriptions had nearly vanished. Hearthstones were recovered, darkened by decades of cooking fires, still carrying the faint chemical signature of burnt animal fat. The floors were compacted earth, worn smooth by generations of bare feet, with post holes indicating wooden roof supports and partition walls of mud brick. In one room, a basalt grinding stone sat in the corner where someone had last used it, roughly 2,000 years ago. This was not a wealthy home. It was a fisherman's dwelling. The kind of house a man named Simon, son of Jonah, might have grown up in before he became Peter, before he became the rock, before he became the keeper of the keys. The inscription. Then, everything changed. During the 2022 excavation season, in the diaconicon of the basilica, and the team uncovered a complete Greek inscription set within a round mosaic medallion framed by 2 parallel lines of black tesserae. The mosaic was filthy, as Professor Aviam described it, caked in 15 centuries of silt. Cleaning it in the blistering summer heat became the season's defining task. Letter by letter, the Greek text emerged from beneath the mud. The inscription named a donor, Constantine, the servant of Christ, not the emperor, but a church member. And it contained a petition, a prayer directed to a specific figure, the chief and commander of the heavenly apostles. In Byzantine Christian tradition, that title belonged to one person and one person only, Peter. As Dr. Notley stated to the press, this discovery is our strongest indicator that Peter had a special association with the basilica, and it was likely dedicated to him. Professor Aviam was more direct. It is a smoking gun. We can now certainly say that this is the church visited by Willibald, and for him it is Bethsaida, so it is for us. The inscription was the earliest archaeological evidence of the faith that recognizes Peter as the chief of the apostles. It confirmed 17 centuries of Christian tradition, and it confirmed that the Church of the Apostles was real. The inscription also settled another debate that had simmered for a century. In 1921, a Franciscan scholar named Father Gaudens Orfali proposed that Peter's home was located not in Bethsaida, but in Capernaum, a few kilometers to the west, where an octagonal Byzantine structure had been found above 1st century domestic remains. The theory gained wide acceptance, and tour guides began pointing to Capernaum as Peter's house. Pilgrim groups flocked there, but Notley and Aviam pointed out an inconvenient fact. For 1,700 years of Christian tradition before Orfali, every source that mentioned Peter's home,
the first Christian kingdom in the world.
But it wasn't the only major religion to find an early foothold here. Before Christianity, Judaism had arrived.
Placed it in Bethsaida, not Capernaum. The octagonal structure at Capernaum was not a basilica and could not have been the Church of the Apostles described by Willibald. The El Araj inscription, with its explicit invocation of Peter, was another nail in the Orphalli theory's coffin. But that was not the whole story. Guarding the heavens, the conservation team thought they were finished. The main inscription in the basilica's diaconicon had been painstakingly cleaned, photographed, and translated. Constantine, a servant of Christ, had made his donation. In the chief and commander of the heavenly apostles, unmistakably Peter, had been invoked. It was a significant find, confirming 17 centuries of Christian tradition. The team was ready to move on to the next section of mosaic. But something bothered conservator Yehoshua Dre. In a section of the diaconicon floor where the mosaic had degraded badly, there were irregularities in the mortar bed, faint shadows that didn't match the visible surface pattern. The tesserae themselves had lost their color over 1,500 years of burial, reduced to uniform gray stones that revealed nothing to the naked eye. But Dre had seen this before in damaged manuscripts and faded paintings. Sometimes what the eye cannot see, technology can. The team brought in equipment originally developed for art restoration, infrared reflectography, and multispectral imaging cameras. These devices capture light wavelengths beyond human vision, revealing pigment traces and subsurface patterns invisible under normal conditions. The tesserae may have been colorless, but the mortar bed beneath them retained something extraordinary. Faint chemical traces of the original pigment arrangement, like a photographic negative preserved in limestone and clay. They set up the cameras on a humid afternoon, the equipment temperamental in the heat. The first scans showed nothing unusual. Then they adjusted the wavelength filters, and the screen lit up with ghostly letters emerging from what had appeared to be blank stone. Greek characters, fragmentary but legible, arranged in 2 lines beneath the main medallion inscription. The room fell silent as Dr. Stephen Notley read the translation aloud. "Guard my house, for I go to prepare the heavens." These words don't appear in any canonical gospel. They're not in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Yet they echo something deeply familiar, Jesus' promise in the Gospel of John. "In my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you."
John 14. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you.
But this inscription is different. This isn't a comforting promise. This is a direct command. And it's not addressed to all believers. It's addressed to one man, Peter. Guard my house, not remember my teachings or spread my word. Guard, a military term, a sentinel's duty, the instruction of someone leaving a trusted soldier to hold a position while they're away. And the house being guarded isn't a metaphor for the church or for faith. It's this house, the fisherman's dwelling in Bethsaida, now buried beneath 15 centuries of mud and stone. The second phrase is even more unsettling. For I go to prepare the heavens. Not heaven, heavens, plural. In first-century Jewish cosmology, heaven wasn't a single destination. It was a layered structure, multiple realms stacked above the earth, each requiring its own preparation, its own guardians. The Apostle Paul himself wrote of being caught up to the third heaven, acknowledging this ancient understanding of a multi-tiered cosmos. What was being prepared? And what exactly was Peter guarding while the work was being done? The inscription offers no answers, only a command carved in stone, hidden beneath a church floor. Awaiting 2,000 years to be read. The lost saying of Jesus. Scholars of early Christianity recognize a category of sayings attributed to Jesus that do not appear in the canonical Gospels. These are called agrapha, unwritten sayings, and they surface in fragments across Gnostic texts, early church fathers, and apocryphal Gospels. The inscription at El Araj may represent one of these lost sayings, an agraphon preserved not in a manuscript but in stone, laid into the floor of a church built over the house of the man to whom the words were spoken. The phrase, "guard my house," carries theological weight that extends far beyond domestic instruction. In the ancient Near East, a house was not merely a dwelling, it was a spiritual boundary, a threshold between the domestic and the divine. In Jewish tradition, the mezuzah on the doorpost marks this boundary. In early Christian theology, Peter himself is described as the keeper of the gates, the holder of the keys to the kingdom of heaven.
The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. A man finds it, and in his joy spends everything.
If the house at Bethsaida is not merely Peter's childhood home, but a location the earliest Christians understood as a sacred threshold, a point where the earthly and the heavenly intersect, then the command to guard it takes on a dimension that is less domestic and more cosmic. And then there is the second half of the inscription, "For I go to prepare the heavens." Not a place in heaven. The heavens. The plural is significant. In first-century Jewish cosmology, heaven was not a single destination. It was a layered structure, multiple heavens stacked above the earth, each with its own function and its own guardians. The Apostle Paul, writing in 2 Corinthians, describes being caught up to the third heaven. The idea that heaven required preparation, that it was under construction, that the divine order was not yet complete, is a radical theological concept. It suggests a cosmos still in the process of being assembled. And it suggests that certain places on earth, certain houses, certain thresholds, needed to be guarded while the work was done. The inscription reframes Peter entirely. He is not merely the rock on which the church is built, he is the watchman at the gate, the fisherman standing in the doorway of his own house, charged with holding the line between the human world and whatever lies beyond it. Guard my house. The house is the node, the threshold is the gate, and Peter is the lock. That what the silt preserved. There's a cruel irony in how Bethsaida disappeared from history. The same catastrophe that erased it from the map also saved it from oblivion. Sometime in the late 3rd century, the Sea of Galilee began to rise. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, relentlessly. The water crept up the shoreline inch by inch, year by year. Homes that had stood for generations found themselves with wet floors, then flooded foundations, then completely submerged. The fishermen who had made their living from the lake watched helplessly as the lake devoured their village. Families abandoned their homes, taking what they could carry. Cooking pots were left on cold hearths. Fishing weights carved from limestone were abandoned on workbenches. Bronze hooks, still sharp after decades of use, nor were left hanging on walls that would soon disappear beneath the water. The village that had raised 3 apostles simply vanished, swallowed by the very lake that had sustained it for centuries. But here's what the ancient residents of Bethsaida didn't know. The silt that buried their homes was also embalming them. As the lake waters rose, fine sediment settled over everything. Floors, walls, tools, pottery. This wasn't violent destruction like an earthquake or fire. This was a gentle burial, a 40-centimeter blanket of oxygen-free mud that created nearly perfect preservation conditions. Organic materials that would normally decay in decades survived for centuries. Wood preserved its grain. Fabric left ghostly impressions in the sediment. Even the chemical signatures of ancient cooking fires remained detectable 2,000 years later. When the Byzantine Christians arrived in the 5th century to build their Church of the Apostles, they may have known through oral tradition exactly where Peter's house had stood, or perhaps they followed pilgrim maps now lost to history. Either way, they built their magnificent basilica directly over the drowned village, never fully realizing what lay beneath their feet. They laid elaborate mosaics, erected marble screens, carved inscriptions into stone. The church stood for nearly 3 centuries, a beacon for pilgrims traveling the Galilee. Then came 749 CE. A massive earthquake, one of the most devastating in the region's history, shook the entire Galilee.
749 Galilee earthquake. A devastating earthquake known in scientific literature as the earthquake of 749 struck.
The Church of the Apostles collapsed. Walls crumbled. The roof caved in. Mosaics that had taken months to create were buried beneath tons of rubble in seconds. But again, destruction became preservation. The earthquake debris acted as a protective shell, shielding the church's remains from weather, looters, and the erosive forces of time. Centuries passed. The Crusaders came and went. The Mamluks built a sugar factory. The Ottomans constructed Beit Habek Mansion directly on top of the ruins. Each new layer compressed and protected what lay beneath, creating a near-perfect stratigraphic archive, a layer cake of history that sealed each era from the one above it. It's as if every disaster that struck this site, the flooding, the earthquake, the centuries of rebuilding, conspired to preserve what mattered most. The mud held its secrets. The rubble stood guard, and beneath it all, waiting in the oxygen-free darkness, lay an inscription that would survive precisely because it had been so thoroughly buried. It almost as if something wanted these particular words to endure. The mud at El Araj has already whispered secrets that scholars and explorers have chased for centuries, but what we've uncovered is only the beginning. Beneath layers of silt and stone, beneath the foundations of churches and villages, lie fragments of a story that may rewrite what we think we know about the earliest days of faith, leadership, and history itself. Who decided to set these words in stone? And why did they risk burying them so deeply? What else has been waiting, patiently, beneath the lake's edge for someone daring enough to uncover it? Every brush of the trowel, every scan of the mosaic brings us closer, but also raises more questions than answers. And as the excavation continues, one question looms larger than any. When history finally speaks, will we be ready to hear what it's been keeping quiet for 2,000 years?